Good afternoon and welcome to another episode today with your host Ehsan Ahmed. Today's video we are going to be talking about landlord licensing in London and how it can apply to not just HMOs in London but across the country. So a brief introduction. So HMO licensing is effectively something that's put in place by the local authorities of a certain town or city to govern the compliance and running of HMOs or houses of multiple occupations to ensure safety standards, fire regulations, general compliance, and to stop things that have happened in the past or may even continue to happen, such as overcrowding, such as really terrible sort of living conditions for the inhabitants, and just general lack of care from the landlord or the managing agents, whoever it may be. So I'm just going to go into the different types of licenses that are available and required depending on the type of property you have. And just a quick side note, obviously it's more applicable to London where we're based. But before I go into that, as I said, my name is Ehsan Ahmed and this video is brought to you in collaboration with Right Room. Right Room is London's leading HMO management company and rooms provider. So getting straight into this. So the three types of licensing schemes that are available are as follows. So you have mandatory licensing, you have additional licensing, and you have selective licensing. So starting off with mandatory licensing is typically for 5 beds and above. It's mandatory. It means that there is no exemption. Whatever part of the UK you're in or whatever part of London you are in, there is absolutely no way you can operate a HMO legally without having the license in place. So the license will typically cover the number of occupants, it will state the room sizes, it will state everything that is important in order to be compliant and follow the rules of the license. The next type of licensing is the additional licensing scheme. And the additional licensing scheme focuses on occupants of 3 and above. And this can apply to 2 beds, 3 beds, up to obviously the mandatory level, which is 5 and above. This has come in I believe around 2022 in London. It's off the back of a lot of agents and landlords doing 2 beds as 3 or renting 3 beds as 4, which previously had no license scheme to it. Again, very similar to the mandatory licensing, the only difference is the number of households and occupants. I'll come into what households stipulates a little bit later in the video. The last one is selective licensing. So selective licensing is where effectively within one area or one ward, which is officially what it's known as, within one ward, irrelevant of the property, you must get a license. So that's something that, whether it's a studio, 1 bed, 2 bed, you would still have to get a license for that specific property. Very, very quickly, typical license terms are 3 to 5 years. However, I have seen HMO council officers try and give 1-year licenses, which is never taken too kindly. Typically licenses are good. They are bringing governance into the market, and it also casts a shadow on those who are operating under the radar without a license, because there's a number of fines that can come into place, specifically rent repayment orders as a result of non-compliance, even if you don't have the license. Key point to remember is that in most situations, London councils or councils in general can take up to 2-3 years to award a license from when you apply. Just remember, you are covered from the second that you apply for the license, not from the point that you're granted the license. So that's a key thing to note here. Obviously, look, the aim of this is to increase the safety and management standards within a property, and just make the market better for everybody involved. So I'm just going to sort of get into a few questions that are probably in your mind when it comes to HMO and licensing in particular. I mean, one of the first ones that's come up is, what are the key differences between mandatory HMO licensing and additional HMO licensing? So the key difference is the number of households and the number of occupants within the property. So I'm going to start with households. So households, you can be one household if you are a mother, father, son, daughter. That's one household. 2 households would obviously be 2 unrelated people. 3 households is the same. Occupants is if you are in a HMO and you've got 5 occupants plus, that would fall under the mandatory licensing scheme, which means that irrelevant of what area of the country you're in, you'll have to apply for the license. With the additional licensing scheme, it is dependent on the area, number one. So there are certain areas that still haven't finalized an additional licensing scheme. I believe Croydon is one of them. And in this particular area, you do not need an additional licensing if your HMO falls under 5 occupants. Obviously, if it's not in a selective licensing borough, that is. So yeah, again, the households there's it's up to 3 households. And again, if you have a property where you have 1 household, then you do not need to apply for it. That doesn't count as a HMO, but typically 3 households is the determining factor. So what are the typical costs involved in applying for a property license in London? So typically costs depend on the number of occupants that you're applying for. During the application process, there's a number of questions that they'll ask you. So they'll ask you sort of the freeholder of the building, the leaseholder, they'll ask for mortgage details, they'll ask to see floor plans, they'll ask to see tenancy agreements, they'll ask to, even recently they've started to ask about fire risk assessments and regulations. Then obviously the basic things like the gas cert, electric cert, EPC, all of these need to be provided. And from my understanding, or from my previous applications, I believe it's roughly about £300 an occupant, and you pay roughly about 70% of the fee up front, and then the remainder on granting, or you can pay it all up front if you wanted to. Next question. What penalties can landlords face for renting out an unlicensed property? Okay, so one specific penalty that landlords can face for renting out an unlicensed property is a rent repayment order. So that's where a tenant files a suit against the landlord or a managing agent where they've come to note that the property is unlicensed and they are hoping for a refund of up to 12 months rent. It's something that has happened many times, but we've also come across a lot of malicious cases where, tenants have come across this, have been made aware, and, they're trying to abuse it in effect. How can landlords stay updated on changes to property licensing laws in London boroughs? So the easiest way to do this, the easiest way to stay on top of it, is just to make sure that you reach out to your local council and you check on the website sort of what the factors are in terms of determining the number of occupants, households, etc. If there's any changes, they do have regular consultations on this as well. So effectively, you can there can be changes made. So it's just important to keep in touch. Obviously, if you have a managing agent, it's their responsibility to do so. We at Right Room sort of specialize within the HMO space, so we can help and have helped with licensing, with compliance, and everything in between. Hope that's beneficial to you guys, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.